Hello and welcome. This is Portsmouth Point's first political debate, and today we're discussing UKIP's recent victory in the Rochester and Strood by-election. Alex, first question. Do you think UKIP will be able to hold their victory in the 2015 general election?
Well, it's an interesting point, Will, because personally for me, in the Rochester by-election, you can potentially argue that for UKIP, the people who voted in favour of it, there are two types of people. There's the core 10% or of the 20% UK voter, who believe just pessimistic about Britain's future, everything's wrong, we need to close up the gates, turn the time back. And personally, I think if I were the Conservative Party who lost this by-election, then they should just leave them, not bother touching them, because they're just going to vote UKIP anyway. However, the other demographic within that is this protest vote, if you would say so, and this idea that they vote UKIP because they promise all the solutions that the big three parties at the moment don't promise. I think personally the aim for the Conservative Party should be to try and grasp those protest voters, and seemingly by not adapting to the UKIP idea of this kind of William Hay Conservative Party, which saw the 3 consecutive losses to the Labour Party early on. So I think it's an interesting point. Will they hold it? I don't think so, but that's depending on how the protest voters go during the actual general election.
I'm not going to comment on whether they hold it for a minute, but I really disagree with the idea of splitting UKIP voters into this dual demographic. I think perhaps when the party originated, that was fair enough. They were more of a protest vote, and that's how people voted. But as they gain momentum, I mean, they have 2 MPs now. They are a serious political party. They're ahead of the Green Party.
They're ahead of the Lib Dems.
Yeah, I mean, they are a real threat in the general election. I think now, Nick Robinson was reporting just before the by-election, and he was speaking to people in Rochester who were going to vote for UKIP. And the people he spoke to, I think, outlined just how wide their voting demographic really is now. They had a black person. I mean, they're accused of being racist, and yet they have black people voting for them. It's sort of a neat little paradox. They also had a Northern Labour voter who had moved to Rochester, which shows they're not just attacking the hardline right, protest, frustrated voters, but they're actually engaging with both sides of the political spectrum, which is going to give them a real advantage in the general election. And then thirdly, there was the businessmen. They're not an economic joke. I think they do have party policies beyond immigration in Europe, even if they're not at the forefront of their campaigning. And so you need to respect them beyond what they have been in the past and accept they're now a real, genuine threat.
And I give them fair play for that. They promise solutions which people would want. And I think that's all well and good. My only concern is it really in the best interest of the country? UKIP do have this, and I'm not sure if this, you can correct me if I'm wrong, this kind of concept of that we're not really sure about what's best for Britain's future. I think the other parties, though they may be changing their tune a bit, which angers a lot of voters, they do have this forward-thinking policies, sorry, I say, where I think for UKIP you do have this quite substantial demographic who really just don't want to know about Britain's future, and they just want to close the gates up, have it back to that other country that it was, say, 20 or 30 years ago. So I do think it's going to be interesting for them. At the moment, I think they're on for political success during the general election. My question would be, how would they be able to hold power and keep these promises about upsetting people in the way that the big three have, and turn into the Lib Dems?
I think a UKIP spokesperson would correct you, because in my eyes, I think you are a bit wrong. I think that they're the ones claiming that as soon as Britain leaves the EU, that's when Britain's future really begins. At the moment, I mean, Nigel Farage would argue that we don't discuss, employment law or what we want to do with whether we want to support wind power or not. And once we do leave the EU, or certainly a UKIP voter, they might not be specifically concerned about the EU and more immigration, I accept that. They would argue that that's when we can really start to have control of our country back and decide whether or not which direction the country should go.
My only thing is, you say this like there's not enough capacity in the UK for immigrants. Clearly there is, and I understand you guys use the Australian point system as kind of how immigration should be controlled. My only comment on that would be that in Australia there's much more immigration than there is in the UK, and we're certainly nowhere near full capacity. I mean, fine, yeah, there are a few stories about how immigration has affected the lives of UK people. My only comment on that would be that it is a very small minority, so be it. And in this sense, does it really have a huge impact? A lot of people can't actually physically give evidence of how it's affected their lives. So, do you care to comment?
I think it's important to keep the UKIP movement in context, because and they're in the media all the time. They have huge political attention, and it's fair enough. They've won the first election for 100 years in the UK on a national level that hasn't been Labour or Conservative. So they have made a huge impact. But in reality, when we get to the general election, you're not looking at Nigel Farage in number 10. That's not a possibility. So, I mean, really, I think the main impact of UKIP as a party is putting forward a few policies that are what people want. I know they have some pretty horrific policies. I mean, I mentioned in something I wrote the other day, they want to ban the teaching of global warming, for example. I mean, I think most people would agree that's outrageous. But at the same time, if they're not in number 10, they're not going to be making those policies, but they're putting pressure on other parties to bring forward issues that people want. I mean, before they even had MPs, they'd already pushed Labour into pushing back benefits for immigrants for 2 years, and pushing the Conservatives into offering a referendum. And I think you can only say that is a good thing, because it is what people want, and it's democratic.
Alex, do you think that the two main parties, Labour and Conservatives, going into this UKIP light mode? I mean, we had Rachel Reeves, Work and Pensions Shadow Secretary, suggesting that proposing that Labour does not want EU migrants to be able to claim benefits within 2 years before they've come here for 2 years. And it's the same with Conservatives now pushing it up from 3 months to 6 months, and also hardening their line on immigration. Do you think that will be a successful strategy?
It's interesting because obviously there's like a significant evidence which shows that mass immigration does help economic performance, whether that be through just general growth. But I think if you look at the majority of immigrants who come to the UK, not many of them come here and claim benefits. In fact, a high majority of them come here, seek work, usually low-end work. It's not high-end, like six-figure salaries kind of thing. They're low, kind of hard-working jobs. And I mean, I guess in some senses, for the people of the UK, it would feel like a successful strategy, because in the mind of the average UKIP voter, correct me if I'm wrong, they do feel that there's this overwhelming sense that migrants are coming to the UK, claiming benefits, and that's having an impact on their life.
I don't think that's necessarily it. I mean, I know you haven't called UKIP racist, other people have, but you seem to have this line on their immigration policy that it won't be beneficial for the country. But if you think about it, if you have the option of, you have 10 immigration slots, hypothetically, and you can have 10 Polish workers who relatively are uneducated, compared to 10 doctors from India, China, anywhere else in Asia, who have this huge level of qualification that would quite clearly benefit our economy, and we have a huge shortage of staffing in the NHS at the moment. And under the current system, they might be blocked from entrance purely because we are obliged to allow this free movement of labour from Europe.
That's a very valid argument, it's extremely rational, but do you think that is the real reason that these voters are turning to UKIP? Because do you think those type of voters, the stereotypically white, elder, over 55, left school at 16, generally working class, do you think that rational argument is really driving them to UKIP, or is it the pressure on wages which they're seeing in their working class industries?
Well, I think there are a number of arguments. I agree with you. There is a demographic of their voters who do fit that bill, and I'd also agree that that's probably what's driving their vote. But at the same time, I've already mentioned the voting demographic of UKIP. I mean, they are not targeting one sector of society now. They're a far more broad party, and therefore their policies are attracting people for more reasons than one.
I think.
But if you have people coming in and taking jobs, it's not just the fact they're taking jobs. If you have people from Poland who have a lower minimum wage, lower living standard in the UK, then they come to our country and are willing to work at a lower level than might be seen as acceptable for someone of equal qualifications in the United Kingdom. And therefore wages are being depressed for our citizens because of the contrast in economic development between the two countries.
Do you have to accept the fact that they're working much harder for smaller wages is going to increase productivity, which I know in a kind of micro level that's not being beneficiary for the worker, but as a whole, as a nation, it boosts the economy. And surely that's what we want as a nation, to see Britain strong, performing economically.
Well, that raises the question: is the government's interest in the wider, the GDP of the country, or is it in the interest of its citizens? And I think those citizens that are turning to UKIP would argue that you're not standing up for the way of life that our ancestors have lived and we intend to live and we thought our children would live. That whole way of life that you can leave school at 16 and still walk into a job, and once you go into that job you can progress. That whole way of life is under threat because of mass immigration, which they perceived and has undoubtedly happened. I mean, the out-of-touchness of the Westminster elite, and I swear I'll only use that term once, can be perhaps most effectively epitomised by the fact that in 2004 Labour thought 13,000 Polish workers would come, and in effect it was up to hundreds of thousands. I mean, the main parties over the course of the last 6 years clearly have not been in touch with a disgruntled portion of the electorate, and when they found a party which they believe broadly represents them, they've supported them en masse, and that is the real reason for the surge of UKIP support.
You mentioned that, but on the contrast, you do have to give UKIP sort of the same idea, the fact that they think that there's this kind of more mass immigration than there actually is. They assume that there's a larger majority who claim benefits don't work when it's significantly less, and there's quite a significantly less portion of those who actually claim benefits. And I understand for the majority of the people who support UKIP, it challenges them because this sense that they've missed out on globalisation that immigration has brought to the UK. And I get you can make the fair point that Westminster is out of touch in this sense, but at the same time, I mean, for these guys, although they are losing out, surely, it's hard to say, but do they have to sacrifice a little for the greater good of the country? And then you refer back to your point about how it should be in the interest of the people, but surely if it's in the interest of the majority of the people for immigration...
I think you have to remember that Rochester wasn't Clacton. Clacton was, number one of UKIP's demographic, the older white working classes we discussed earlier. Rochester was people who had been included in globalisation, but they're still concerned about immigration. And 271st, I believe it was, on their most favourable seats. I mean, this is a real threat to the main parties.
I think UKIP do a really good job of putting out their issues on a level that's as prominent as possible without exaggerating ridiculously. Because if you think about the UKIP electorate, and we've spoken about their demographic, they still do have a huge demographic of disgruntled voters against the political elite. And in politics at the moment, we've got this interesting balance where political engagement is increasing. We've seen polling of up to 80% in the Scottish referendum, which is totally unprecedented.
84, yeah.
And at the same time, we've seen people's attitudes towards politicians becoming far more disgruntled, and we're feeling that politicians aren't representing the people in society. So when UKIP put forward these policies, and they're seen as the party who represent the people, it's very difficult for the Conservatives, who epitomise the Westminster elite, and even the Labour Party, who now, I mean, there's a big worry for Ed Miliband about how his party is being perceived in terms of their political outlook and engagement with society. But if you send a load of Westminster elite Conservative MPs to go and try and convince voters who don't like the Westminster elite to vote for them, I mean, what can you do? I think they're a bit stuck.
Do you think maybe that a third Tory defection would in a way harm UKIP because it would kind of cement the image that they're just the estranged cousins of the Tories and would possibly diminish their chances of succeeding in the northern areas where they are a bit successful?
I think that's a big thing. One of the UKIP MEPs was talking on TV the other night and saying, actually, the two possible Conservative defections that they've been speaking about aren't the main issue. Farage is actually targeting Labour seats, because if you end up with a UKIP party based around Tory defectors, what they've become is a party representing the people morphed into a party representing the right-wing Conservatives. And I think the Labour vote's going to be a really big deal. But I do think UKIP have a chance of pulling this back, because if you think about how polling is conducted in the country at the moment, whereas it used to be on a nationalist level, it's gone to, with the introduction of Lord Ashcroft's polling system, and now UKIP Dones are picking up on this too, if they can identify constituencies where they're going to do particularly well, they can take this to MPs in any party. They can take it to Labour MPs, they can take it to Tory MPs. I don't think the Liberal Democrat MPs will probably speak to them. But if they did, they can tell them that they're going to win their seats easier if they are with UKIP. And I think that's going to play a big part in diversifying their party.
Just to reiterate the question, from a Conservative point of view, what do you think is the best way to tackle this increase in UKIP support? Do you think it's best?
I think the main thing is not to morph into UKIP light.
Right.
Because, I mean, you need to express concern for the electorate. You need to show that you've acknowledged the electorate's concern regarding immigration. But equally, I mean, there was a poll yesterday regarding Emily Thornberry's tweet about the flags, St George's flags, and 19% of people feel uncomfortable, and this is genuinely true, when they see a St George's flag on a house, because obviously there are perceived connotations of nationalism and perhaps racism at the end of the day. So there's still an extremely large portion of the population who absolutely detest UKIP. I think there was another poll which said 24% of people would not regard somebody would see somebody in a lesser light if they found out they supported UKIP. I mean, so by chasing these other voters, which is what both of the main parties are currently trying to do, they will undoubtedly, potentially give support to the Lib Dems for free. I think what they have to do is explain to the public that immigration, at the end of the day, is a good thing. And they have to do that without sounding patronising. They have to do it without necessarily figures. They have to make the public see immigration as a more local level. Nobody wants a person in the corner shop to be kicked out of the country. Nobody wants their NHS doctor, who's more likely to be an immigrant, to be kicked out of the country. They just want the general squeeze on services and housing to be stopped. And that's the way to really tackle UKIP, is to tackle those issues by building more houses and at the end of the day solving the immigration problem.
I think the thing for UKIP is you have to realise that immigration is a huge aspect of the UK. I think it's a statistic that 1 in 4 doctors in the NHS is from outside the UK, and seemingly it helps the economy. I mean, that's quite a bold statement to make, but the statistics show, if you look at places like Germany, which is mass immigration of Poles, Hungarians, people like that, or seemingly Australia, they're economically performing successfully due to immigration. And I think, but this is quite a bold thing, but to reduce immigration may potentially harm economic growth for the country. And I know that's probably going to sound a bit selfish, but I do think some people, ideally the kind of working class UKIP voter, should potentially have to sacrifice his lack of education for the welfare of the country.
I completely agree with you, but where I disagree with what you've said in the past is that UKIP's policy isn't actually going to do what you've just said. I mean, if you do reduce immigration significantly, I think you will experience negative economic growth. But their immigration policy isn't this mass attack on immigration. It's this mass attack on free movement of labour from countries who have lower economic development than we do inside the European Union. And if UKIP were encouraging, as Australia do, skilled workers on a points-based system to come in and contribute on the maximum level possible to our economy, I think that has to be more beneficial than just sort of a random allowance of anyone from Europe to come and work in our economy.
Absolutely. Do you think, changing topic slightly, do you think Labour have a core problem at the moment with appealing to the people they were set up to represent, the working class? I mean, we had Emily Thornberry's tweet, which saw her get fired because she just posted a photo of a white van with a couple of flags. Do you think they're really having problems connecting with their core vote?
Yeah, completely. If you look at Conservatives, I think it's fair to say that pretty much the majority of the South is Conservative and will stay Conservative. And I think where UKIP have been quite successful in this way is really kind of connecting with the working class people of the North and all these things in a way that Labour just hasn't quite done. They're still seen as one of these big political parties who doesn't quite have their message right, and they keep adjusting their tune. And I think UKIP successfully, I give them fair play for this, has managed to set out their policies in a way that does appeal to the working class voter. And so definitely going forward to the 2015 general election, you can definitely make the point that UKIP have really challenge Labour for their core voters, and I think it's going to be really interesting to see how they're going to handle that in the general election, how Ed Miliband and his party are going to alter their tune to try and collect their, like you said, the demographic which they thought they had, which UKIP have challenged now, so it's an interesting point actually.
You said at the beginning, I'll move away from Labour because we're meant to be talking about UKIP, but you mentioned you don't think UKIP will hold on to the seats at the general election. Why don't you think they will?
Correct me if I'm wrong, I still just think there is this level of protest vote. This idea that the other parties aren't really listening, they still think of UKIP as a joke, and I think in this sense, by them voting for it, it will lead to the big three actually having to sit down and to look back and think, wow, we need to adjust our policies to attract these people who we've obviously now become out of touch with. So I just think there is still, although UKIP have solidified themselves as a legitimate party now, I just still think there is this kind of sense of protest. I mean, because if you like I said before, there's obviously your key voters and there's that, but I still think there is a level of protest, and so if the big three can deal with that, which I'm assuming unless they're completely incompetent, then they will, I don't know how that's going to affect UKIP with regards to the general election?
I completely disagree with you. I mean, at the end of the day, there was a poll out yesterday or 2 days ago which showed that 52% of UKIP voters currently across the country will definitely vote UKIP. I think low 20% think they most likely will. And I mean, comparing that to the Labour figures, which is a significant amount lower, it's around 45, 46, and then around 19. UKIP are a force which is going to last for a long time. You can't just expect for the first past the post like Dome to dissolve their charge at Westminster.
I think on the specific issue of Rochester, because it's not like a normal election seat. There's been a by-election. It's a completely individual scenario, and the fact they did only win a majority of just under 3,000, which was slimmer than what was expected, has created this sort of rhetoric. Are they going to be able to hold on by the general election? But I think there's this misperception going on because the chairman of the Lib Dem party was speaking about this. Labour have spoke about this, and they are justifying their horrendous performance in that by-election because their voters have voted tactically to help the Conservatives. So when you think about what this 3,000 majority for UKIP really is, it's not just a 3,000 majority over the Conservatives. The Conservative vote was made up of Lib Dem tactical voters, was made up of Labour tactical voters, who have all experienced significant drops from when Rochester was last elected. So when it comes to the general election, and I'd predict that people aren't going to vote in that way in the general election. You won't have Labour voters voting for the Tories because the Labour don't want a Tory seat. So I think UKIP will be able to hold on to this, and I think the idea of turning around this UKIP momentum, I mean, it's not just stopping UKIP progressing. You've then got to spin the cycle back round and have a Conservative up-and-coming momentum into the general election, and I think they've left it too late. I mean, 6 months to spin that round. I don't think it's going to happen.
How many seats do you think they'll win?
I think it's completely hard to predict because of the first past the post system. I mean, in terms of percentage of the vote, probably between 15 and 20, but what that will actually translate to in terms of seats is really difficult. But I think it's a good thing we've had these by-elections because it's given people confidence. I mean, previously there was huge speculation whether they'd actually win a seat at all because of the first past the post system. But now they've won it, now they have MPs. I think the notion of UKIP being a serious party within Westminster rather than the outlying rebellion is important for voters because in a general election you want to know your vote's going to count. And previously you may not think it would have done, but now I think voters will have belief.
Do you think, I mean, you picked up on Nick Robinson's BBC report a few days ago. Quite a few voters were saying, you know, we'll give them a chance to see what they can do. The power of two MPs, especially two MPs which is not backed by a vast army of resources behind them, do you think they actually can do anything in Parliament? And when they inevitably can't, do you think that voters will be dismayed and possibly go back to their main parties?
But if you were UKIP and they said, what could you do in Parliament, wouldn't you say, well, look what we've done out of Parliament? I mean, there is no way we would be looking at a referendum on Europe, which is probably one of the biggest political reforms we'd seen in recent political history if we were to leave the EU in the coming term. That would never have happened without UKIP. I mean, the leader of the Conservatives is a Europhile. Labour are pro-Europe. They're not even offering a referendum. So what UKIP have done is they've come into politics with no MPs and completely changed the landscape.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, but there are a portion of the electorate who did vote UKIP who have this mentality, you know, we've had this same establishment for X amount of years, far too long, let's give the new boys a go, when in reality these new boys are just defected old boys. But do you think when they can't do anything, that specific portion of the population will revert?
Are you talking in the run-up to the general election they can't do anything, or after?
They undoubtedly will not be able to accomplish anything in Parliament before the general election.
Well, on those terms, you've already said 50% of UKIP voters are definitely going to vote UKIP.
Yeah.
Now, presuming the other 50% aren't definitely not going to vote UKIP.
It's 26% are likely to. What about the 25% who are considering their other options? And that's the most likely, you know, that's the portion who are thinking, if these guys don't accomplish anything, I've just wasted my time.
I mean, look at the political momentum. I mean, UKIP are winning seats. Labour are having to have their cabinet ministers resigning over terrible allegations regarding disrespect for the people who they're supposedly representing. Conservatives are quite clearly losing momentum to UKIP anyway in terms of these by-elections. So I just don't see it spinning round and dragging seats away from UKIP. I think it's only going to get better.
Could you potentially see, say UKIP do get some form of power, could you potentially see them becoming like the Lib Dem party?
Oh, absolutely. That's the main challenge they have to face.
Yeah.
If they do get 6 or 7, which I think is the most likely number, if they do get 6, 7 or 8 MPs, what can they really do with that? I mean, the only scenario where they would have, Farage would be absolutely cackling with laughter, would be if the Conservatives are, 6 or 7 short of a majority, and they can run a minority government, get the EU referendum, and then well, even then, once we're outside the EU, do voters go back to the original parties? It's absolute mayhem.
I think what they'll do is if they have the opportunity to force parties into accepting their terms. For example, if, as you say, Conservatives need another 7 seats to get into government, they'll say, we want a referendum soon. And, I mean, they've achieved their goal in that sense, if that happens. And after that, I think it's too early to speculate. But if that's an achievement they can make, I think it's a pretty huge achievement.
What do you say to voters who are they've been Conservative for many years and they're not too concerned with immigration, but they want to be outside the EU? Do you think they're dampening the Conservatives' chances if they vote UK? Do you think they're dampening the country's chances of leaving the EU if they vote UK?
No, I don't, because, to be honest, I think UKIP are likely to have some influence on the next term in Parliament, whether that's in terms of Labour or in terms of the Conservatives. And I think eventually, Labour are representing the working class, and the majority of the working class are sceptical about UKIP, to say the least. So eventually, there's going to have to be some democratic process to choose whether we want to be in Europe or whether we want to be out of Europe. We can't just have Ed Miliband sat in number 10 saying we love Europe, and the rest of his electorate saying we hate Europe. So I think after that, UKIP are going to influence whoever's in power, and we'll have to have a referendum.
Nick Clegg had a disastrous Rochester. What do you think they can do to recover? I mean, they're 349 votes from 8,000 in 2010.
To be honest, I really don't think Lib Dems have any chance of recovering, especially with regard to this general election. I think it has come down to UKIP, Labour and Conservative. I think Lib Dems personally out of it. They've had their chance in the coalition to have some say, and I think they just haven't lived up to what they've promised. And for them, that's going to cause mass discontent with the public. And so I think for them, for the Lib Dems, I think it's not pointless, but it's going to be very hard for them to do well in this next general election after the failure of this recent coalition.
What about their base of electorate? Because they've always had very loyal seats where they've consistently won elected MPs. I mean, how many do you think they're going to get in the next Parliament?
It's going to be hard to predict, to be honest. I don't know how much the level of discontent within the public is going to affect their seats. I mean, like you said, they've already have a core support, so I guess in that sense they'll probably keep that, but it depends how many of the Lib Dem demographic are going to be swung by the influences of UKIP and the other two big parties.
I think it's a really interesting one because historically, Nick Clegg got mugged off by Farage in the debates over Europe, but in the debates up to the general election, he's consistently done well. He was good in the last election. So, on that sense, I think they're going to gain some support through those debates. And after that, I think they have to be looking at over 15 MPs in Parliament, regardless of how low their support has fallen to. So, with 15 MPs, they're in a stronger position than UKIP to form a coalition. And I think they might be underrated in terms of what's going to happen at the general election. There's a real possibility they might be a coalition.
I completely agree. I think we could be seeing another Lib Lab or Lib Con coalition. I think, as you said, Nick Clegg is a strong performer in the TV debates. Also, as the two main parties push for UKIP light mode, then more of these kind of voters might be disgruntled with them and might switch back to the Lib Dems. Also, a lot of their seats is what you'll find is they're in kind of core areas where spotted around the country, where they've campaigned locally for years. Everyone knows their local MP and they're really committed to supporting them. I really doubt we'll be seeing the Liberal Democrats have below 20 MPs after 2015.
Just as a question, what percentage of Lib Dem voters do you think have switched to UKIP primarily because the Lib Dems has almost now become part of this Westminster elite, and now that UKIP are the new kids on the block who are promising all these bold things which appear to be good for the country, although I won't go into my views on that. What percent?
I think of the three main parties, and I'm talking about Labour, Lib Dems and Conservative, Lib Dems are probably the least covered by this notion of a political elite. I think their party chairman, Tim Farron, is pretty down to earth in terms of the people, and he's often on TV, and I think people respect him for that. So I don't think they are going to lose a huge amount of support to UKIP. I think where they will lose support is people recognising they're losing a deposit in by-elections and they're not going to have any influence.
People don't want to have a wasted vote. And if you look at the Rochester mass, what happened was the Lib Dems went down to 8,000, UKIP went up, but obviously the Lib Dem voters didn't go straight to UKIP. Lib Dem voters might have went to Labour or Conservatives to try and stop the UKIP threats we discussed earlier with tactical voting against UKIP. Similarly, do you think UKIP, as a kind of smaller party than the main one, they've only got 40,000 members, which is still a decent size, do you think they'll struggle when they have to fight, 40 or 50 seats in the next election? Because currently they've only had to fight one seat at a time. They can bus in all their activists and get away with it.
I think they're going to have to prioritise. They're going to have to look at their electorate, look where they're strongest, and where they are strongest is where the UKIP campaigners aren't going to bother with. I mean, you're not going to have a load of UKIP campaigners sent by Farage to try and win a seat full of Europhiles. It's just not going to happen. So they're going to exploit those seats and make sure they have at least an acceptable number of MPs in Parliament to ensure they're still a credible party by the end of the general election. Wrap that.
Thank you for listening.
Yeah, thank you.
Alright. I reckon it's too long.
Yeah, I think we should cut the end.
Yeah. London is chosen.